And here we go.
Welcome everyone to HITEC Live. Bienvenidos. If you are new to HITEC, welcome. I am Kelly Francis, the director of the HITEC Foundation. I have been with the organization close to 2 months now, and this is just my second time leading a HITEC Live, so a little bit of grace would be very much appreciated. We are always so excited to host HITEC Lives and bring our community together. If this is your first event with us, HITEC Live is a bi-monthly series where we bring together the Hispanic technology community to connect, share, and learn something new. Our sessions are informal conversations where we get to hear from our partners and community members on topics that touch on tech, leadership, DE&I, and everything in between. As always, we do a little networking at the end of the session, so if you can, please be sure to stick around. Today, we're chatting with our friends and partners, EY, who over the years has engaged with HITEC on thought leadership and mentorship. We truly appreciate your support. A few housekeeping items before I introduce the session. Please go ahead and rename yourself with your name and your company if possible. You could find it up at the three little dots by your picture in the right-hand corner. Please also keep your cameras on. We would love for this to be an interactive, engaging session. Now let's get to it. Today, EY will educate us more on the benefit of utilizing ESG, both at a societal level and at a company health level, generating more resilient strategies for clients. Please join me in giving a big welcome to Harish Arora, Executive Director, EY, and Brandon Sutcliffe, sorry, I should have gotten these pronunciations down first, partner and principal at EY. They focus on the need for a comprehensive ESG solution and delve in the technology and data requirements within the financial services industry. Brandon serves as the EY America's Financial Services Sustainable Finance Leader. He has more than 25 years of consulting experience with a focus on advising financial services clients on sustainable finance, risk, regulatory, and compliance management. Prior to joining EY, Brandon specialized in the energy services industry, working with clients to gain savings on their energy costs and reduce their carbon footprint. Definitely something we need nowadays with the rising gas costs. Harish is a technology executive in EY's Financial Services Office, where he leads data architecture and data engineering competencies. He is responsible for creating and delivering data-driven recommendations and growing a team of high-performing individuals. Harish leads the ESG data products development and advises clients on technology and data strategy in the sustainable finance space. Please give both Harish and Brandon a warm welcome. I will turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Really appreciate it. And welcome everybody. We're really excited for the conversation and dialogue today. We do have a presentation that we will walk through, but really just it's really just there to help guide the conversation. Hopefully this will be interactive, and please interrupt us at any point of time, ask questions, and we'll go from there. So with that, if we can switch to the next slide. Yeah, you can keep it here. You know, at the end of the day, this is sustainable finance, ESG, environment, social, and governance is a critical thing for us to address, right? And I think what we're highlighting here is that, you know, there will be no jobs, there will be not much of anything if we don't address, in particular, climate for sure. So with that, one of the questions that I always get, because we refer to sustainable finance, people always ask the question, what is sustainable finance? And so what I do like to do is just at least define it, maybe go to the first slide there. For us, sustainable finance is any financial service that incentivizes the environmental, social, governance criteria into business decision process for the benefit of society and our communities that we live in, right? So it really is about the E, S, and the G, and how financial services can play a big role in supporting the transition to a more sustainable society. And that's where I think, you probably are inundated at this point with the news around climate change in particular, right? It's the most front and center. It impacts us all on a physical level, for sure. We're all in areas that, get inundated by floods potentially, or we might be in an era of forest fires, droughts, all of the above, right? So it is something that we all are very comfortable and understand it. And that's why I think a lot of the focus is there. And historically, companies have always sort of focused on the social side of things, right? We've had, corporate social responsibility programs in our institutions. They've evolved to more of, ESG reporting, and now a lot of the organizations have chief sustainability offices that help coordinate all of the various different activities from both an environmental and a social. And certainly, the governance has always been in our financial services firms in different aspects of it. We've addressed the privacy and the cyber security related things, and certainly the focus of the boards is critically important. So maybe if we move to the next slide. So sustainability, sustainable finance and financial services coming out of COP26, the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, over 450 financial institutions signed up for GFANZ, which is over $130 trillion in assets under management, a lot of capital to deploy to help us with the transition to that. And so what you're seeing now is firms putting together, helping to calculate their actual baseline emissions, financial services in particular focused on scope 3 emissions, and doing it sort of sector by sector. The higher fossil fuel emitting sectors going first, energy, oil, and gas. And all of that is for them to really understand and set the targets to meet their net zero commitments by 2050. And a key to being able to do that for organizations, and this is where Harish will go into a lot more detail throughout the presentation, is data, right? Data and technology. In order to calculate the baseline emissions, you have to have counterparty level information on your portfolio and your various different activities. That data isn't necessarily available publicly, and that's part of the reason why a lot of the global standards, and certainly the SEC's most recent climate-related disclosure proposal, is trying to address that, so that there's more transparency around what firms' scope 1 and 2 emissions are, their direct emissions, so that financial institutions can help calculate some of those scope 3 emissions. And so I think we're seeing those standards coming together. We saw the announcement of the International Standard Setting Board at COP. The SEC also put out some guidance for the asset management space as well, around the name rule, and making changes to and updating the Financial Investors Act guidance. And so I think we're going to see even more convergence on a global basis. Hopefully a lot of that being driven by the International Standard Setting Board and coordinating across the globe with the other regulatory bodies. And the last thing before I turn it over to you, Harish, to start to delve a little bit deeper into the data side is, consumer preferences have changed, right? And everybody is looking for more sustainable related products and services. And so that's going to be a big driver of this as well, not just the regulatory pressure, not just the investors and what they are looking for from a return and investment strategy perspective around ESG. I think the consumers are going to push the agenda pretty hard in the coming years to make sure that firms are thinking about and being more sustainable. And that's really what's going to enable these institutions to create long-term value for their stakeholders. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Harish, and we can dive a little bit deeper into the data side of things.
Of course, no, thank you, Brandon. Hopefully you all can hear me. I'm still getting my voice back, was a little bit under weather. Excited to be here, very nice to meet you all. As Brandon described, I mean, sustainable finance or sustainability is not a new topic. It has been out there for many, many years. So why now? And if we were to, start to look back 10 years, or a decade from here, the 70% or so of the company's market value today is traditionally, it has been mostly tangible, and now it's made up of intangible assets. And the examples of those intangible assets are intellectual property or brand awareness or goodwill or perception of what company has as an effect on the society and the environment, which is what is essentially changing the whole ballgame. When you look at one side, which is the providers of the capital, such as banks, insurers, asset owners, asset managers, or the consumer of the capital to the right, which is your small businesses, your large institutions and corporations and consumers, they all have started to realize that how significant it is for them to start to consider the intangible aspects around impact and sustainability that they have never looked up before. So what this map starts to do is kind of bring that view together, where it's no more just the dependency of your accounting book of record and your tangible book value of the company, rather the 70% of the dark data associated with the intangible book value. So as you can start to imagine, the measurement of the intangible components is extremely, extremely hard, right? And there's really no accounting engine that can easily calculate the total impact or total intangible value of a company. So the value and the impact system, as you see to the right, are essentially can be divided in 4 categories. One, which we have always seen and been there around the financial value, which traditionally makes up your tangible book. Customer value, for example, impact and the value of repeat businesses by engaging, by looking at the repeat customer, by integrating your customer voice and stewardship in the decisions. The third is around the people value, for example, measurement of the positive impact and the amount of dollars that you're spending in innovation, the association with the diverse team that is bringing in that innovation comes in. And then lastly, and not least, is the societal value, which feeds into this intangible component, is around, and that's where a lot of focus, in the subsequent slides as well will go in. This is where the measurement of the carbon footprint as an example of your lending portfolio to understand what is your total impact, which then essentially feed into the overall value of your company. So maybe I'll pause after every page and see if there are any questions and then continue on. Okay, if not.
Harish, just a quick question. These slides will be available after the presentation. They're quite useful.
No, certainly, David, we can make that happen.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. So with that, why don't we dive into, the typical challenges, and we are going to talk about these challenges in multiple dimensions. Among the first of many dimensions, it is an extremely complex and extremely data dependent issue when we talk about ESG. I know Brandon touched upon it, and we're going to unpack this and unpeel this onion to the levels possible. When we look at the demands from internal teams, from clients, from investors, from regulators, most of them require an integration. They don't want to look at E, S, and G in silo. They require an integration of E, S, and G attribute for the said company. Now, typically, this start to lead to how do you start to integrate? Because when you look at S, or the social data as listed here, that typically resides in your HR system like PeopleSoft and Workday and like. Some of it reside in your CRM application like Salesforce and others, and some in the marketing application. So a lot of S, which can be translated in a 3P form to the people pillar, traditionally live in your human resources and CRM applications. A lot of E, or the environmental, which can be translated in a 3P framework to the planet pillar, is typically offers. And by offers, I mean does not live within the company infrastructure, company's firewall. So either there's a dependency to a third-party data aggregator to provide you with emission, efficiency, liability data, or a heavy lifting and extreme amount of engineering to leverage a lot of open data sources from NGOs that are reporting the child labor incidents as an example, or the data coming from your different, emission suppliers, etc. And we will continue to unpack this further. And the last, which is G, and again, going back to mapping it to a 3P pillar, we talked about people, just as we talked about planet, which is E. The G ties to the principles, right? And so it's no more just the ethics of the company and the rails that it is playing within, rather tying it to your mission, your vision, your principles, and truly talking about the transparency across tax, across structure, across executive pay, across information privacy. And a lot of this data today lives in your ERP applications like SAP and others. It lives in your FP&A application, your financial planning applications and like. And the expectations from clients, from regulators, from your internal consumer is to not look at these data assets in silo, rather have a holistic view to be able to look at ESG report. And a practical example there, if you look at SASB provision, right? It has about 5 disclosure topic, and about 13 different metric per industry. And those 13 metric for the particular industry require data coming from no more, one or more of these different circles. So the integration of the ESG data becomes the primary challenge. Quick pause as I continue to move on. Please let me know, or I can keep going, and feel free to interrupt as you have any questions.
Harish, do you mind if I ask you a question here just before you move to the next slide? Just looking at the 3 pillars that we have here, the E, S, and G, your analogy of planet, people, and principles. Will you subscribe to the fact that perhaps the G may probably be more critical, important, because the major decisions that are being made are basically being directed from the boardroom, and if we, a slide that Brandon presented already, that only 20% of the board is kind of buying into this criteria of climate being a top 3 issue. 20% is a very low number that exists right now with board members. So given that there's no sense of urgency occurring at the board level, and there's no directive to the CEOs and to the rest of the company to pursue changes, what are your thoughts about perhaps increasing the awareness and the pressure on the G as opposed to the E and S?
I think that's a great question. Maybe I'll start, and Ben, feel free to add to it. I'll split what you said into two parts, right? One is the influence and impact and the sponsorship that you can get from the board down to CEO, down to the rest of the firm. That I wouldn't translate that directly into the G pillar of ESG, right? The G pillar of ESG has traditionally, over the last 60, 70 years, have always existed in the name of corporate governance. And the corporate governance there is ensuring that, you know, your books are right, everything is assured and audited, there's a transparency in the structure and like, and now it is being a little more integrated under the triangle of ESG. I think what you're asking is, how do I start to influence my board, my CEO, my executive, to give the due importance to the overall sustainable finance? And which is where we are seeing that, you know, not every company, even until today, has a sustainability office or an extreme focus in the sustainable finance agenda, especially on the private market side. Because when you look at a lot of public company, about 3,000 some listed company in US, or about 9,000 globally, majority of them have started to abide by the disclosures and the regulations, the commitment to the net zero. However, that only make up, you know, about 40% of the market. The remaining, look at the private equity or look at the real estate, they all do not yet have a strong regulatory push, or, you know, a discretionary, non-discretionary requirement to be doing that. So, and there's a lot of influence essentially that is required there to follow. Does that take it?
Yeah, perhaps a little bit of feedback here. You know, I'm being in discussions with private equity firms, and I'm a little bit surprised that their level of attention to this matter is probably even higher than what I have seen on the public companies at this point. But these are, you know, talking about, you know, the large PE firms like KKR, TPG, Blackstone, Carlyle. I don't know if the rest of the private equity world at probably at lower levels will probably be emphasizing this matter. But I will tell you, you know, the big guys are probably even doing a better job than much of the public companies out there in terms of supporting ESG initiatives. I don't know, it's just because institutional investors are asking those kind of questions before they commit to additional funds into PE firms. But there's a lot more happening right now with the large PE firms. So.
Yeah, no, I think we see the same thing working with a bunch of them ourselves. I mean, the due diligence that goes into these deals, you know, didn't historically include ESG. Now it does, right? So we're certainly seeing that trend. And I think just back to your original question, to add to Harish's comments, I mean, board, management, they're all really engaged in this conversation now, right? And that's accelerated and changed just over the last year even, right? Coming out of COP26 for sure. And the engagement is a lot of it, the board, it's education, right? What is ESG? What does it mean to their organizations, and how can they influence the management to embed ESG into pretty much everything that the firm does to create long-term value for that particular organization, right? So we are seeing it now a lot more pervasive across all levels of the firm.
Thank you, Brent.
Awesome, great dialogue, David, and please feel free to interrupt if there are more questions along the way. Looking at the clock, I'll perhaps move. I know we talked about SASB, which is, you know, one of the many, but did you know, I was surprised too, as I was putting together this material, there are over 600 provisions already as they're attached to the sustainable finance. And what is provision in this context is a framework, is a methodology, is a standard, is a regulation, and essentially a combination of that, but limited to the sustainable finance, or, you know, some people say ESG realm of the word. They're rapidly growing. As you can see, about half of them have been created just in the last 5 years, and it gets dated as soon as it get published, because the number continues to increase. And the most recent one Brandon touched upon is the one from SEC, which talks about the name rule as well as the disclosure for the investment advisor. And this, so we talked about the ESG integration challenge. This is another challenge. It's not just your SOX report at CCAT and the Basel of the world. You have, depending on the geographies that you are running your business in, there are many frameworks, methodologies, and regulations which you cannot select, but a lot of choices out there that you need to now align to based on your materiality or what matters to your company, and then start to select and report on those. We talked about provision. Now let's talk about the data.
Yeah, maybe Harish, sorry to interrupt you, maybe just to add one more thing there, because I did touch on it, but I don't know if everybody is aware of what the International Standard Setting Board is. Is everybody aware about what that is?
No, please clarify.
Okay. So, I mean, the International Standard Setting Board is really trying to attempt, it's part of the IFRS Foundation. It was announced, the formation of it at COP26. And the intention is to really pull together a lot of, not all 600, I don't think, Harish, but the intent is to pull together a lot of the various different frameworks that exist and the institutions, the organizations that are managing those frameworks, right? So as an example, SASB already got pulled in under the value reporting framework, and the Climate Disclosure Standard Board is part and parcel of that as well. And it tries to pull in the foundational aspects of the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. And so they're coming out with guidance and pulling together a lot of these different frameworks. Now, for the US, since it's IFRS foundation, and we never adopted IFRS, that doesn't have as huge of an impact on us. But I think that the fact that the ISSB is using the TCFD sort of as the foundational aspect of some of the, at least the climate related disclosures, so is the SEC. I think it helps with the potential fragmentation that could happen from a regulatory perspective around the globe. They're trying to address the fragmentation for sure. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon, for the additional context. Moving on the data side, if you recall, we talked about the E, S, and G in that triangle, and how S and G is significantly dependent on us data, and E is a lot more on off us data. So this is the data that is not living in your ERP, your CRM, your marketing, your finance applications, essentially. The availability of comparable ESG raw data continues to be the hurdle. David talked about the private equity, even if they are focused on it, the way PE firms are reporting versus the Citibank and JP Morgan and Wells Fargo's of the world report aligned to a particular framework is significantly different. And how do you start to really look at and compare? And it's also well ahead of the cost that it takes to process, as well as the advanced analytics capabilities that are needed. So looking at this, there is a lack of trust. There are gaps in standards, and there's a very degree of the completeness of the ESG information, which is why, no pun intended, it's a polluted space of the ESG data aggregators and ESG data providers that have emerged over the last several years. And they look at not just the disclosures that are publicly made, but overlay that information with the information reported from the alternative sources, such as your annual report, your 10K, your 10Q filing, extract the information from there, look at the data coming from your NGOs, look at the data coming from the satellite as an example, as it implies to the overall environmental impact, and start to not just aggregate all those data points and provide to you in a nice form and shape, but also start to apply a computation engine to essentially give you a score, which you can then use similar to a credit score like ESG, and start to make your insightful decision for your lending portfolio, for your investment portfolio, and in general for your net new products. So we talked about the integration challenge. We talked about the number of provisions. We talked about the complex data aggregation space that is out there. Now let's talk about how this data aggregation space also implicitly has multiple challenges, right? And as you see, unlike a FICO score, or when you look at the S&P and Moody's that have been doing the credit rating that institutions use for many, many years, it is still an evolving space, right? And the fact that ESG rating agencies have different objectives in an absence of a standardized regulation or a framework around it, and that they use different format, different weights, different metrics, very different methodology, as you can see in some of the cases here, absolutely different calculation framework. It makes it extremely, extremely difficult for firms to now start to get a comparability and consistency of the ESG data that is reported. You know, and we will talk briefly about one or two examples, but more broadly, when you look at MSCI in this example, where MSCI is rating companies in a AAA format, which is equivalent to how the credit rating is done today by Moody's and S&Ps of the world, while Refinitiv is coding them in a numerical 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 format, which is essentially easier to calculate. Now, at me as a company, if I had a large institutional lending portfolio or a small business portfolio or a large asset ownership with underlying public companies, it gets extremely challenging to essentially get that comparability and the consistency of the underlying companies. So we talked about a particular example, so let's go into that, right? When you look at the rating from any two ESG rating agencies, such as MSCI and Sustainalytics, in this example, the correlation, unfortunately, and this is why I said the market is still evolving, is less than a half. You know, there was a Wall Street article journal that talked about and calculated that correlation of MSCI and Sustainalytics score for, you know, not just one company, but for an overall industry at a 0.45 level. And to put that in perspective, compare that to the credit rating that are done today by S&P and Moody's, and the correlation there is typically around 0.92. So if you take an institution, a company, and look at the credit rating, it is going to be pretty tight and close. But if you look at the same thing and try to understand the ESG rating of that company from two very popular data sources, it is only going to be as good as half and half. So in that article, as we were researching, there was also, they were also trying, able to get the more detailed data around Tesla. So what you see here is a divergence of E, S, and G score, where E is significantly different, right? As you could see, the darker dot, the lighter dot, and a square are all across the spectrum. The social is slightly less. However, governance is a little bit tightly aligned. And you may ask, why? Why does this happen? And there are many, many, many years of the research behind it. And a lot of people have done a lot of amazing work. One that you see to the right with the amazing title called Aggregate Confusion, where that research paper published by one of the MITers talk about the 56% or so divergence is coming from the measurement approach, the way each of these rating agencies are measuring on the different companies. About 38% or 40% of it come from the scope. the scope that they have, and the scope could be the various different geographies, the various different industries, and the overall coverage. And lastly, the about 5 to 10% of it comes from the weight, because each of them apply a different weighting criteria to underlying companies to essentially get to a score. So an extremely, extremely interesting topic, an extremely complex topic. But I think as you start to understand all the way from trying to integrate ESG, trying to understand your various different provisions that are out there, trying to understand the plethora of the ESG scoring companies, and then diving deeper into, even after you're able to get and source all of that data, how diverse it is and starting to make sense out of it is essentially what makes ESG or sustainable finance a data issue. So quick pause, any comments, any questions so far? I want to make sure this is interactive and you're getting the value from it.
I'm sorry, Harish, it's me here again. Another question I have, just following up on what you just presented. So the way I look at this is that most of these index scores and factors that we're trying to kind of keep track of, data, they're mostly forward-looking points of reference, and I can understand that because you're trying to kind of measure kind of the sort of impact of the various strategies and investments that are taking place. However, a big concern that I have with this is, what do we do and how we kind of measure stranded assets, right? So a lot, with the change of climate, let's say in the South, and droughts happening and large migration happening, we're going to leave a lot of assets behind, and some kind of underutilized capacity that's not going to be there anymore. How are we accounting for that opportunity cost of keep budgeting to support future stranded assets, as opposed to kind of rechanneling those investments and funding towards building infrastructure in the places where we expect people be moving forward to it, right? Going to the Great Lakes area, whatever, how is this being measured, or is it being considered at all under these factors that you just presented? So
I think that's an amazing and very, very, very loaded question. That's going to take 2 hours just to have that conversation. So, and let me clarify a few things. The ratings, the data that scoring agencies rely on is not forward-looking. It's typically backward-looking, right? Because the significant driver and the dependency there is the disclosures, which is typically a year old. And then they start to overlay some of the information that is coming from more event-driven news or media articles and like, but majority of the data is backward-looking, right? Now, you talked about a very specific use case about, how do we look at the investment portfolio and start to, not just look at why it has underperformed in a certain way, be it ESG or a price performance dimensions, but also look at how we can start to optimize and manage so that the future funding is essentially not going in something that is called the green fund, rather to be able to still elevate what we have. So we will touch upon a few of those topics further down, if you allow me, talking about, potentially how to start to solve the ESG data and technology challenge. And if it doesn't answer your question, then, we can certainly get additional time and kind of have a little more deep dive there. Is that fair? I assume you said yes.
yes, please go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, so just to try to complete the material, as we have been seeing now, among all the complexities, as they say, things aren't always very clear unless you reframe the problem a new way, and which is what we attempted to do, not in a relational approach, rather more in a pictorial graphical way to demonstrate the complexity that it has. What you're seeing here is a fraction of complex relationship that exists in the sustainable finance space today. Again, Tesla is one of my favorites, taking the example because they have no doubt have been ahead of the curve when it comes to the environmental impact that they have been able to create through EVs and through solar panels and otherwise. However, the whole debate that I'm sure you saw through the media articles last year, which is now subsiding, around Tesla and the batteries that it uses, which uses cobalt, which is essentially mined by the child labor in Dominican Republic of Congo. How can we start to leverage that data point, which is traditionally reported by an NGO, start to see the overall traceability of that mining and the event trigger associated with that mining to the manufacturer, to the portfolio impact that an institutional investor or an asset manager or an assets owner is going to have associated with it, right? It's an extremely complex supply chain, and you can start to appreciate what all goes behind it, the integration of ESG, various different provisions, complexity of, or limited correlation, I should say, of the underlying providers and the extreme complex relationships. So with that, why don't we wrap this particular section and then talk about, to David's point, how do we start to have a framework and a methodology around it to start to solve for some of these challenges. So summarizing, low correlation, high inconsistency, extremely complex relationships of the data to make any insightful decisions, challenges with integration of the data, as well as linking them to the UN goals. I know we didn't talk about it, but there are like 10 of them, and we can briefly talk in subsequent pages around what those UN goals are and how you can start to align. Typically, these disclosures we talked about are manual, so the frequency of the data refresh is extremely low. A lot of the data aggregators have started to solve for that challenge by integrating a lot of alternative and open data sets and the media outlets. And the last, extremely low trust in the quality of the data we talked about, be it the correlation, which is still at about half, or the self-reported aspect of it, because as an entity, I'm doing a disclosure and I'm, in an absence of an attestation requirement or an SEC rule, I'm going to try to make me look good. So that causes the low trust in both the quality of the data as well as the quality of the data that has been self-reported by those disclosure reports. So that ends our first chapter. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into how we can leverage the technology and the data to start to address some of these challenges. And what you will see in the subsequent pages is focused on having a frame of reference or a framework or a methodology to try to address these various dimensions of the challenges. Right? So let's think of this challenge in 4 dimensions, right? As we go through the detail, let us use this framework to start to make selections and the choices across these 4 dimensions. So we talked about ESG data providers in detail. What data provider as an entity, and you could be both the capital provider or a capital consumer, right? In that example, what ESG data providers make more sense to you? Because you may already have some in your ecosystem that you might want to extend. A lot of them, are grown out of the data companies who have been providing the product master, sec master, the counterparty information, energy information in past. How can you start to either extend them or, pick net new of these data providers? And a fun fact there, I know we talked a lot about the challenges and the number of data providers and how many are out there. While there are several dozen, I promise, there about 3 of them cover a little over 60-65% of the market the last time I looked, right? So point being, it's a no-brainer that if you were starting on this journey, you can select one of those top 3 that are serving about 60-70% of the market and start there if you did not have a specific choice. Second being the provisions or the standard setter, however you want to name it, picking the standard, picking the methodology, picking the approach and the regulatory framework, depending on your firm and what different geographies does it serve and support, as well as aligning to what is material to you. And that's where the concept of materiality assessment come in, to look at and introspect as your firm, tying it to your mission, vision, value, and saying that what makes most impact to the community is essentially what I want to do and want to abide by that framework, as an example. Or I care most for the stakeholder value, and eventually, whether talk about the tangible or intangible aspect, I want to make sure that there's a traceability into the financial impact it is creating. And then you essentially pick one of the DCFDs and like. So align to what matters to you, pick a reporting framework or a methodology. The ESG tech, and this is where you start to make your buy versus build versus rent or lease kind of decisions, where you must already have a lot of these tech and tools in your environment. What can you start to extend? If you have a lot of SAP as an example, a lot of PeopleSoft running, a lot of ServiceNow running, potentially you can use one of those choices to do the disclosure reporting. And there are a lot of net new greenfield areas where you can start to onboard new technologies as well. And lastly, the outcome, because all of this is of no use if you don't drive the business services and outcome. So prioritizing and driving down the use cases. Some of them are obviously non-discretionary in nature, like the reg reporting, like the taxonomy, while others that you have to develop, or we see a lot of our friends on the Wall Street wanting to develop to essentially build the differentiated capability. So quick pause here, any feedback, any questions, and then we can dive deeper into each of those 4 dimensions. Awesome, I'll take that as a no. So let's deep dive, starting with the provision, right? This is where almost think of it as a Chinese menu of your provisions, grouped with common themes. Those themes around disclosure, standard, taxonomy, regulation, and the partnership. And we kind of touched upon this topic, so I'll just fly by this. What is your preferred disclosure framework? Some have narrow focus like climate and environment, and some have much broader focus, inclusive of governance aspects of it. What standards your firm closely aligned to? For example, CDP and GRI have broader stakeholder focus, while SASB's focus, given its tying to the finances, is more catered toward the investors. So what does that do, and how can you start to pick and choose that? What taxonomy applies to you? We talked about, depending on the geography that your business support, you essentially pick the EU taxonomy as an example. If you have businesses in Russia, you look at the green taxonomy, that is your requirement in the Russia and the business. So align to these various functions within your firm, such as banking, such as lending or asset management, wealth advisory, asset ownership. The set of regulations differ, and then you need to start to not just pick, essentially abide by those regulations. If you're a bank, you need to abide by BES and do the stress testing. If you were an asset manager supporting European market, you are required to follow the SFDR regulation as well. So this is, a framework to start picking what provisions or standards and regulation. So now, think of this as not a 600 rows in an Excel, rather the more logical themes around, okay, I want to abide by this disclosure. My company is already perhaps doing a TCFD reporting. I want to start to follow this, the CDP and GRI to do so. And so these are the regulations that, apply to my business. And then, we briefly talked about the alignment to all of this, to the UN development goal, or many of the global alliances and the partnerships that are out there. Very similar, let's talk about the technology ecosystem. This is a double click into that, right? Where ESG, we talked about, is certainly one of the most polluted tech spaces, right next to the digital currency, so either people are talking about the Bitcoins or they're talking about the sustainable finance or ESG over the last 12 months or so. So there are many fintech providers, climate tech providers that have essentially evolved in this space. So given the vastness of the use cases, the number of areas that ESG supply chain touches, it is usually not one size fits all ever, right? And we talked about it briefly that you could potentially use, your Microsoft stack for a few things, and your workflow engine, whatever that may be, for a few things. You might have a low code, no code environment and can start to build an application using that. So extending offering within your portfolio management system to, as an example, help to rebalance the portfolio. So it's, once again, it's not either or, and that's where it becomes a menu of choices where you can start to extend some, start to buy some, start to build some, and start to rent some. And why emphasis on the build? Because, we interviewed a lot of chief investment officer, about 200 some, and there was one consistent feedback was around building a custom solution to not just treat ESG as a risk play or an audit play, but also treat it as an opportunity, as an alpha generation that you can start to use to develop new products, develop new services, and generate new revenue streams. And we'll talk about it, how a little over $40 trillion have flown into the ESG market in the last few years or so. The last data sources, and this is, again, cannot emphasize enough around how ESG is really a data problem and the extent of the data dependency associated with ESG. So when you look at ESG disclosures, reporting, analytics, management relies on significant amount of data coming from these sources, and data aggregators do an amazing job. That's why they're number one in the teams. However, that is traditionally have been okay, but to make a differentiated capability is not sufficient, right? So what you're seeing here, in addition to the data aggregator and commercial data providers, public data sources such as your fund fact sheet, your company disclosure report, your 10K, your 10Q, your annual report, your news stories, your media articles are all required to be integrated. This is what your chief data office, chief analytics office, the chief information office can make as a priority and start to pick and choose around what data sets do I already have, what data sets can I start to ingest and onboard, and what data set make most sense to me for the set of use cases I want to deliver, right? So let's take a quick practical example. If you, let's say, wanted to research a company, right, and a company research around the sustainability commitment that they have made, right, such as who you may be, and that company could be somebody that you are lending to, if you are a lender, commercial or otherwise, That could be a company that you're investing in, both as an independent individual investor as well as a big, large institutional investor like an asset manager. Or it could potentially be a company that is a key supplier, right? And we have a lot of suppliers. Dell provides computers and Cisco provides routers. And like that, you have many small businesses and large institutions that are your key suppliers, right? So how would you deal with that when you wanted to understand their sustainability commitments? You can purchase your ESG scores and several associated ESG data attributes that come with it. Like MSCI has about 8,000 some of those attributes. You can then overlay that data with the revenue drivers and motivation that you can extract by processing unstructured data from the annual report. You can then assess their commitment to innovation, as an example, by getting the data set from the patent and the trademark office. And then lastly, you can, if you were to go that path, get the legal liabilities or the labor practices coming from the media outlet, which is a little more recent. So in this example, you start to see that how, while my anchor was this underlying procured data set, all of these alternative data sources have tremendous value in integrating to start to identify the sustainability commitment that one of my suppliers has. Quick pause, any questions? Awesome. If not, super quickly, this is essentially where all roads meet to an end around the outcome and what we want to deliver. So we selected our data set, we picked up our technology choices, we gained alignment to the ESG provisions, and now we can start to deliver some of these outcomes, right? And these outcomes are, I'll call them business services. They differ depending on the businesses that you are in or you want to deliver. This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but the set of examples as they apply in a large financial institution doing a full service financial support to the community. You could have your consumer credit, your wholesale credit, your institutional arm of it, your asset and investment arm of it, and the different set of use cases. Again, relying on the same foundational underlying technology and data infrastructure is what you're seeing here. So let's wrap up this section very quickly. As I say, buy or rent for parity, to try to meet or get to a point with your competitors and your peers, but build for differentiation. And we see that as a trend across the market, where a lot of buying patterns are to try to get to a point, and then we see a lot of our friends on the street wanting to build a differentiated capability in-house and essentially have an IP around it. When thinking about ESG or anything else, start small, scale fast, and have a North Star in mind. And by that, what I mean, while you may or can deliver on a credit risk or the stress testing on day one, because that's where a lot of dollars are being spent, do have a final North Star in mind around what all use cases that essentially will come out of your underlying tech and data foundation. And lastly, the left and the right are always changing. And in this example, the left being your data, right? Because all of your data coming from these different sources, the connections, the volume, the velocity is always changing, as well as your right, which is also always changing around provision, around the business services that you want to deliver. So build something in the middle, which is your technical foundation, which can provide the abstraction to your changing left and to your changing right. So with that, I'll pause. I know we had some more architectural view, but I also want to be respectful of time and, maybe pause here and see if, if you want to go further, or, would love to just get to know the audience and answer any of the questions that may be there.
I think you're doing a terrific job here, Harish. So at least I'm benefiting from all this. So thank you very much.
Of course. So Kelly, I think we'll maybe take your guidance.
Yeah, so I think I would be interested. We have just kind of a small group here. If those would be interested in maybe introducing themselves and kind of how this topic aligns to either what they're working on or future goals. And then I'm gonna just drop in the chat really quickly. Our next event is coming up at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. It is our HITEC 50 Awards celebration. You are all welcome to join us. But I think to kind of integrate the next part of the conversation, we could either go into the ESG architecture convo. I think it would be helpful to just know who's here. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves and kind of how this aligns to what you're working on. We'll start with David first and then go from there.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. David Arenas, the reason I'm very interested in probably have a little bit of knowledge of this space. I came from an engineering career, turned into an investment banker, a technology investment banker, launched the energy technology practice for SG Cowen. That was about 20 years ago, so way ahead of my time. So I was diving into solar, wind, ocean power technologies, fuel cells, and all that. But now with the situations happening right now with climate change and ESG and all these factors that both Harish and Brandon are presenting quite expertly, I'm right now serving as a managing principal for a board advisory services firm. And that's the reason the issue of governance is very important for me to kind of understand and get their perspective. So thank you. I serve as a mentor to HITEC E+ executives here. So.
Yes, thank you, David. Christine mentioned all of the great insights that you bring to our EEP fellows. So thank you for that. Jason, if you're here, would you like to introduce yourself? I won't wait very long. I'll move on kind of in the row of who I see. So Pat.
Tony, I have a question, excuse me.
Sure.
Before joining HITEC, I came from JP Morgan, like the finance world. I'm kind of interested to know what types of challenges have you experienced, like when a client adopted ESG standards and how you kind of overcame those challenges, if you have like an example you can share.
A finance specific example?
No, just in general.
Oh, okay. I guess I'll give I can give a few examples, right? I think one of the things that we have seen is a lot of financial institutions have made commitments aligned to GFANs, and I think JP Morgan was probably the largest, right? 2.3 trillion that they committed to help finance the transition to a more sustainable society. And I don't know if they actually did a bottoms up assessment of all of the different ESG related activities they currently were doing to come up with those commitments necessarily. And so I think what a lot of them are doing today is trying to figure out what all of those activities are. Data plays a critical part in that. And so we're helping them overcome that in a couple different ways. One, on the finance to mission side, helping them calculate their baseline emissions for their high fossil fuel sectors initially, energy, oil, and gas as an example. And, as part of that challenge, we have to do a lot of data scrubbing. And even if you take, one of the data providers that Harish mentioned, even one of the better ones, there's still a lot of holes and gaps in that data and information for them to be able to calculate the baseline emissions for a specific portfolio. whether it's because they're private companies or it's just they don't have the information. So you have to use proxies and other things to help support those activities until the data is available, or in some cases go directly to the counterparty to get that information. So we work with them to cleanse that data, come up with the strategy for calculating the baseline emissions based upon the type of portfolio. Most of the times sort of aligned to PCAF, Partnership for Carbon Accounting, and then help them set their targets. And one of the challenges that they face that we also support them on is educating their bankers, their front office. What does it mean for their clients? How are they going to have that conversation with their clients about that transition? The thing that most people think just in general is that, oh my gosh, we're not going to give any more money to, energy companies or anything else, right? Well, that's not the case, right? They may not give new money to build a new power plant that's a coal-fired power plant, but they're going to have to give some money to invest in unwinding that coal-fired power plant that they have in existence today in a responsible way. And so responsible investing is huge. So we help them with some of those challenges. And obviously the easy answer is and David, you referenced it, right? The investment in renewables and other things, right? Of course, there's going to be money available for that, right? Because that's going to help you further get towards your targets. So that's just one example, financed emissions and what our clients' challenges, what they're facing, and how we've helped them overcome those challenges.
Thank you. Super helpful. Very good example.
Are there any other questions before we wrap this up? Just a reminder, we are recording the event and we'll be sharing it. And Harish has also given permission for us to share the deck with the attendees as well. If not, I just would like to extend a very warm thank you to Harish and Brandon. Excellent presentation on a very deep topic that I think for many of us, I know for myself, I learned a lot from your presentation today. So thank you both for sharing your insights, your knowledge, and your resources with us and with the whole HITEC community. We are very grateful. And with that, we hope that you will join us for the HITEC 50 celebration later on today, and if not, for our next HITEC Live. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.